Ghost Ships of the Arthur Kill by Wheeler Antabanez. Captain Frank backed his truck down the Carteret boat ramp until the trailer tires were completely submerged. As soon as the parking brake was engaged, he gave the signal, and I climbed out over the water to unhitch the jet boat from the winch. With a quick shove to the nose, she was afloat, pulling gently at the painter line in my hand. Within minutes, we were out on the water, smashing along at high speeds down the choppy Arthur Kill. Heading south, we followed in the wash of a tugboat, pushing a huge barge with a giant construction crane lashed to its deck. The barge had quite a head start, but we easily overtook her at the stern. I assumed Frank would slow down, but instead he told me to hold on and hit the throttle towards the heavy wake. As we met the first of the rolling waves, the little jet boat launched clear out of the water, and I held on for dear life with a huge smile on my face. With jet power on our side, it didn't take long before we found ourselves closing in on the Staten Island Ship Graveyard. The rusting specters of the Arthur Kill were soon towering before us in all their nautical glory, and Frank eased up on the gas as he turned out of the channel. The tide was still going out as we approached the first of the wrecks. The water was a little too shallow for comfort, but we had come prepared for this eventuality. When Frank was finally forced to cut the engine completely, I scampered into the bow and grabbed a canoe paddle to propel us further in. The water was remarkably clear, allowing us to see the muddy bottom, which was now about 2 feet below the boat. Using the paddles as poles, we were able to maneuver our way through an opening between sunken ships. As we emerged from this narrow entrance, Frank and I were greeted by an abandoned wonderland of maritime beauty spreading out before us. Pulling our way down a narrow passage between monolithic hulls, we gazed up at our surroundings in awe. There were so many wrecks piled in such a chaotic state of disrepair that it was often hard to tell exactly what types of ships we were looking at. The sky was threatening to storm as we tied up to the first shipwreck of the day and climbed aboard. Making our way cautiously across the Swiss cheese steel deck, we avoided the rusted-out hulls as best we could so as not to fall straight through into the water below. There was a time-worn ladder on the bulkhead of the forecastle, and we climbed it up to the bow, which is the highest point of this particular ship. The view from here was fantastic. Sprawling below us was a vast wasteland of junked ferries, submarines, tugboats, and warships, piled together in the shallows. Behind us, the Fresh Kills landfill dominated the sky and consumed the horizon. After taking pictures from the forecastle, we descended the rusty ladder and made our way back to Frank's boat. She made for an efficiently stable platform as we climbed down and untied from the shipwreck. Continuing to pull our way through the oxidized labyrinth, there were many bumps and scrapes from below, but the tough fiberglass hull bounced over jagged steel obstructions with little complaint and no damage. She had been designed primarily for speed, but with her minimal draft and absence of a propeller, the jet boat proved invaluable for infiltrating this graveyard of ships. We tied up alongside and boarded many of the half-sunk vessels, but as we explored our way towards the epicenter of the graveyard, one ship stood out among the rest. She was a massive wood and iron tug from World War II and could be considered the main centerpiece of this aquatic necropolis. Despite having her stern completely submerged, this ship was taller than all the rest. Luckily, we reached her just in time as the sky opened up and the rain burst forth. We were soon up and over the soggy rail, making our way along the port side to enter the interior of the tug. One of the first things I noticed inside the trashed cabin was a dead cormorant mummified among the debris. The feathered corpse lay in repose at the foot of a brittle wooden ladder. I stepped over it to climb through a hatchway onto the rain-slicked steel deck of the bow. Frank soon followed, but there was scant shelter from the storm here, so we made our way around the bridge of the listing ship in search of a dry place. The stairs to the wheelhouse were missing, but we climbed up anyway to stand where the captain and his mates had once charted their course through the waves of the open sea. Outside, the storm began to dramatically intensify, torrential rain glossing and coating the wrecks as it fell sideways from the sky on the whipping wind. I happily clicked photos out the empty portholes as the storm drenched the scuttled ships and caused them to run with sheets of fresh water. Frank spent his time looking through the captain's desk, which was bolted to the wall. Shuffling through an ancient bundle of tattered papers, he turned to me and said, "You have to admit, this is better than any abandoned building." I smiled, and after a moment's consideration, grudgingly agreed. I have a deep love for vacant architecture, but it is hard to top the experience of climbing around on these decaying ghost ships. A rain that hard couldn't sustain itself for long, and eventually began to peter out. The little white jet boat had been grimy from our dirty feet, but was now washed clean by the storm. As we hopped back in, we couldn't help muddying the seats all over again, but at that point we were so filthy and damp from climbing around the ships that we paid it no mind. I paddled us out into deeper water until I heard Frank start the jet boat's 120 horsepower motor. This was my cue to drop the paddle and grab the two handles on the bow in preparation for a takeoff. Seeing that I was secure, Frank slammed the throttle forward, and in seconds we were up on plane, rocketing across the Arthur Kill towards the Jersey side for a little lunch and more abandoned adventures. Our destination was a listing 1920s-era ferry boat scuttled off a rotting pier in Port Reading, New Jersey. The decrepit pink and white ferry has gone by many names in the past, but in her abandonment a graffiti artist has rechristened her the SS Meow Man. Across the anchorage from Meow Man stands the abandoned McMyler coal dumper known as Big Mac. This incredibly large shiploading machine towers 90 feet into the sky, but is rapidly falling to pieces in the salty air. Built in 1917 and abandoned in the 1980s, the mammoth coal chute on the front of the structure was toppled during Hurricane Irene and now sags to the ground where it rests on the concrete pier. Frank and I had previously anchored at this port back in 2011 for a similar lunch break when we were out cruising in his other boat, the Jersey Tomato. The Tomato is a much bigger and more comfortable speedboat than the tiny 14-foot jet racer, but is equipped with an outdrive, which doesn't allow for approaching shipwrecks. Today, in the jet boat, however, Frank motored boldly up to the port side of the listing wreck, and I grabbed onto the rickety handrail, tying us up to the staircase of the second-floor passenger deck. Once I was safely up on the platform, Frank handed me the bagged lunch and then climbed aboard as well. The ferry was listing badly, and the floors of the main deck were sketchy, to say the least, but she was beautiful in her decay. To gain access to the interior, we had to step over a large hole that went down into the flooded hold of the ferry. Dark green water shimmered below as I jumped the chasm and surveyed my surroundings from firmer footing. The wooden bench seats had been torn apart by vandals, but aside from the vessel's new name spray-painted on the bow, there was very little graffiti covering the ship. When I climbed up on the roof, I could see why. The pier that this ferry had once been moored against is now completely collapsed, making access from land impossible. After lunch on the broken benches, we jumped back over the hole and climbed up crumbling steel steps to the top deck. 6 massive air intake tubes jutted cartoonishly from the steel roof. Their chip pink paint made me feel like I was in Teletubby land. Above our heads, a pair of nesting osprey had constructed their home in the basket of the ferry boat's towering crow's nest. We could hear babies up there scrabbling about, and the outraged osprey parents angrily dove at our heads as we stepped lightly across the top deck. The entire roof was littered with an amazing assortment of bones from both fish and mammal, making it clear that a wide array of birds used this ferry as a banquet hall. Crouching down to examine a bone pile, I spotted an egg too large and white to have come from the osprey nest. The shell looked perfectly intact, but as I picked it up, the stench hit me, and I could tell that it was a dud. This was a great blue heron egg, and it was the first of many rotten ones we would find on the SS Meow Man. As I was showing Frank the egg, he pointed across the water to the coal dumper, and I looked over in time to see 4 great blue herons take flight simultaneously from the very top of the structure. Making our way over to the stern of the ferry, we discovered a beautiful cast-iron spiral staircase coiling its way from the top deck all the way into the glistening green water below. These steps were just as sturdy as the day they were installed, so we descended the spiral staircase for pictures of the submerged lower level of the ferry. The Arthur Kill was rippling around the wreck on the incoming tide and was so clear that I wanted to jump right in and go swimming. I resisted the urge and made my way back into the interior of the passenger deck, scaring a small flock of pigeons that took flight through the empty windows. The afternoon sun was burning brightly in the sky, and all traces of the storm had now passed us by. We spent more time poking around the passenger deck, then hopped back in the jet boat for the short trip across the slip to the coal dumper. The soaring shiploader in front of us seemed to rise even taller as we approached. The dock was also much higher than it had appeared from far away, but we improvised, using a tire as a handhold to climb up the concrete pier. It didn't take long before we were inside, scrutinizing the enormous pulleys and winches that were silently collecting rust in the cavernous darkness of the engine room. Coal dust still covered the floor, and our sneakers added to the footprints from previous explorers who had left their tracks in the anthracite powder. We stopped at the end of the building to survey our surroundings, and Frank pointed out a pair of tin cans strung up in the window that someone had shot full of holes. Examining the colossal innards of the dumper, we began to get a sense of how this incredible ship loader used to operate. Engineers would start by bringing the coal to the base of the machine in enormous rail cars. One by one, each car would get pushed up the steep incline by an iron mule, which is still in place to this day. Once the coal car was in position on the hopper, they would lock it in tight and flip the entire train car upside down. The load of coal would cascade out of the car in one massive pour, then get funneled into a waiting barge or ship below by way of the chute. Once the coal car was empty, it would then get flipped right side up and pushed over the edge of a steep set of rail tracks. This would send it hurtling along on a roller coaster ride over the water, providing quite a thrill for the brakeman whose job it was to ride along with the car. Propelled entirely by gravity, the coal car would barrel down the tracks to the end of the line, where it would then roll up a steep quarter pipe in order to lose momentum. On the way back down the quarter pipe, the wheels of the car would go through an ingenious switching mechanism that transferred it onto a landward set of tracks. Once back on shore, the car would get hitched up behind a locomotive and sent off to the coal mine to start the whole process over again. Frank and I balanced our way up along the rail tracks until we were at the level where the coal was flipped and dumped. We could have climbed the ladders all the way up to the top, but just getting up to this level was sketchy enough. Entropy has taken a large bite out of the Big Mac, and the danger here comes not only from the possibility of falling, but also from what might come toppling down from above. Visiting the McMyler dumper in a windstorm would not be advisable. When the breeze picks up on the Arthur Kill, the Big Mac rains steel. We spent a good amount of time walking around the coal dumper, taking photos, but as always when boating, the waves and the salt wind were calling. Back in the jet boat, we swigged some much-needed water and then took off in a cloud of blue two-stroke smoke on our way up the Arthur Kill. Just for the hell of it, we raced along at high speeds past the Carteret boat ramp all the way up beyond the Goethals Bridge, taking in the sights of the Bayway refinery and the towering power plants dominating the New Jersey shoreline. Along the way, we met up with many large ships chugging to and from Newark Bay. Frank steered us over their wakes like a stuntman as I held onto the grips and braced for each jarring impact. The sun was low in the sky when we finally turned around and made our way back to the ramp. As we neared the entrance, Frank apparently needed one last thrill because he suddenly veered to port, sped into the shipping lane, and then hooked back to starboard in a sharp G-force-inducing curve that put the jet boat right at the top of her capabilities. Just as we were about to double back on our own wake, Frank cut to port again, zooming towards the ramp. I thought we were going to crash, but Frank knows his craft. At the last possible second, he nonchalantly cut the engine, and we were able to slow down enough so there was only a slight bump as we came to rest against the dock. The people sitting on the benches atop the pier were watching our approach, and they all stood up in unison with alarmed looks on their faces. As I hopped out and lashed the painter line to a cleat, they lined the rail, staring down at us as if we were insane. Frank and I just glanced at each other and laughed. If these people could have seen all the crazy stuff we were doing that day, our little high-speed docking maneuver would have seemed like child's play. Boating with Captain Frank is always rewarding, but today was an especially fun adventure on the wet and wild borders of New Jersey and New York.
You can read this story, along with many other strange tales, in issue 45 of Weird New Jersey magazine, on sale now at weirdnj.com and newsstands across the Garden State. For more nautical adventures from Wheeler, visit luckycigarette.com.